Daniel Mercer looked like the kind of man who could never lie. But every word that ever came out of his mouth was part of a 20-year deception that fooled his wife, his neighbors, and even the FBI. Daniel Mercer was the kind of man people trusted instantly. He had the easy charm of someone who never seemed to try too hard. Always smiling, always polite, always exactly what others wanted him to be. To the residents of Brookfield, he was a model husband, a devoted father, and the neighbor you could always count on. He kept his lawn neatly trimmed, waved to everyone during his morning jogs, and donated generously to community projects. People described him as a man who had it all: a steady career, a beautiful home, and a loving wife who adored him. Laura Mercer often said Daniel made her feel safe. She had met him years earlier at a charity fundraiser, where he was volunteering to organize finances for a local shelter. His intelligence and quiet confidence drew her in. Their marriage seemed perfect from the outside. 15 years together, no public arguments, and a life that others envied. Friends admired how Daniel always remembered birthdays and anniversaries, how he spoke fondly of his wife at social gatherings, how he never raised his voice. It was hard to imagine him as anything but the perfect husband. Their home on Maple Drive reflected that image of perfection. A white picket fence surrounded a lush garden Laura tended every spring. A golden retriever named Cooper played on the lawn, and Daniel was often seen tossing a ball for him in the evenings. They hosted summer barbecues, attended church on Sundays, and took yearly trips to the coast. Laura decorated their living room with photographs of smiling faces and vacations, moments that painted the picture of a marriage built on trust and love. But behind the soft-spoken demeanor and tidy routines, Daniel was someone else entirely. He kept a separate phone locked in his desk drawer, one that Laura never saw. When she went to bed, he often stayed in his office late into the night, whispering into that phone or staring at his computer screen for hours. He told her he was managing clients' portfolios, but the truth was far more complicated. Daniel wasn't his real name, and Brookfield wasn't the first town he had called home. In another life. Years before Laura met him, he had been someone else, a man who fled under a different identity, leaving behind debts, suspicion, and unfinished crimes. He had learned how to disappear so completely that even law enforcement couldn't trace him. Every piece of Daniel Mercer's life was carefully constructed, from his resume to his social security number, from his bank records to the false memories he shared about his childhood. He had built an entire existence on lies, and he had become very good at keeping them hidden. No one in Brookfield would ever have guessed that the man who smiled at their children from across the street had a past full of deceit. Daniel blended so well that even Laura never questioned the small inconsistencies, the way he avoided old friends, how he changed the subject whenever she asked about his family, or how he never spoke about his parents in detail. He told her they had passed away long ago. She believed him because everything else about him felt genuine. Daniel. Control was everything. He had learned that the more normal you appeared, the less anyone looked too closely. The charm, the good deeds, the reliability, it all worked like armor. And in a small town like Brookfield, once people decided you were good, they rarely changed their minds. One could see the cracks forming beneath the surface. The secrets were buried deep, protected by years of careful planning. But secrets like his never stayed hidden forever. All it took was one unexpected event, one loose thread, to unravel the image he had built so perfectly. Daniel Mercer had spent 2 decades mastering the art of deception. He thought he had erased his past. What he didn't realize was that the past was already making its way back to him, quietly, patiently, waiting for the perfect moment to expose the man behind the mask. It began with small signs that most people wouldn't have noticed. Laura Mercer stopped showing up for her volunteer shifts at the local library, missed a few lunches with friends, and didn't return phone calls. At first, no one thought much of it. She was known to be busy, often juggling community events and household responsibilities. But when 2 days passed without a single word, her closest friend, Maggie, grew concerned. Laura never vanished without telling anyone where she was going. Daniel appeared calm when the police first knocked on his door. He told them Laura had gone to visit her sister in North Carolina. She needed a break, he explained, smiling sadly as if the situation pained him deeply. He showed them a message on his phone, supposedly from Laura, saying she needed some time alone. The officers saw the text, and it seemed reasonable enough. They thanked him and left, believing a temporary separation between husband and wife wasn't a crime. But Laura's sister denied everything. She hadn't heard from Laura in months, and no one in her family knew of any trip. That's when the tone of the investigation changed. Detectives returned to the Mercer home with more questions, this time looking for inconsistencies. Still, Daniel didn't lose his composure. He invited them in, offered coffee, and spoke softly, as though genuinely heartbroken. He described Laura as the love of his life, someone who had been distant lately, perhaps dealing with stress. His grief seemed sincere. Even the detectives admitted later that he seemed like a man going through something painful, not a suspect hiding a secret. The search of the property revealed nothing unusual. Laura's car was in the garage, her purse gone, and her credit cards untouched since the day she supposedly left. Neighbors remembered seeing her watering plants the evening before she disappeared, smiling as she waved at the mailman. Nothing seemed out of place. The only odd detail came from a delivery driver who mentioned Daniel had ordered large amounts of cleaning supplies a week before Laura vanished. He claimed it was for home maintenance, and with no physical evidence of wrongdoing. The police moved on. As days turned into weeks, Brookfield grew uneasy. Posters of Laura's face appeared on shop windows and bulletin boards. Volunteers searched the surrounding woods and nearby lakes. They found no trace of her, not even a piece of clothing. The media began covering the story, painting Daniel as a grieving husband desperate for answers. He played the part flawlessly, standing before cameras with red eyes and trembling hands, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. People sympathized with him. They brought food, sent cards, and offered prayers. The town rallied around him, convinced that Laura had been taken or had suffered some tragic accident. When the investigation slowed, Daniel quietly resumed his life. He returned to work, attended church, and resumed his nightly jogs through the neighborhood. He told everyone he was trying to heal, that he believed Laura would come home when she was ready. He seemed patient, strong, even noble. No one saw the subtle changes, how he stopped wearing his wedding ring, how the charm that once felt natural began to look rehearsed. What no one knew was that Daniel had already erased every piece of Laura from his financial world. Bank transfers began appearing in offshore accounts under names the investigators had never heard of. He sold her jewelry, closed her insurance policies, and removed her name from property deeds. Everything he did was quiet, methodical, and precise. He had rehearsed it before. When winter came, the search ended. The police called it an unresolved disappearance. People whispered but eventually moved on. Daniel Mercer was free to live his life, untouched by suspicion, his mask still perfectly in place. The woman who had once trusted him completely was gone, and he had made sure no one would ever find out how 0.5 years passed before anyone mentioned Laura Mercer's name again. Time had softened the story into a local tragedy, one that people only brought up when a new family moved into the neighborhood and asked about the missing woman from Maple Drive. Daniel had become almost untouchable in those years. He'd moved to a smaller house, taken a new job at a financial firm in a nearby city, and appeared to rebuild his life. To those who knew him, he was a man who had suffered deeply but found a way to move forward. Then a discovery far from Brookfield began to unravel everything. A construction crew clearing land for a new road near the old Mercer property unearthed a buried suitcase. It was rusted and half decayed, the kind of thing most people might assume was old trash. But when one of the workers pried it open, what they found sent them straight to the police. Inside were women's clothes, several pieces of jewelry, and a passport in the name of Laura Mercer. At first, it seemed like the missing woman's belongings had been buried there. But the photo in the passport didn't match Laura at all. The FBI took over when they learned that the woman in the passport photo had been reported missing 15 years earlier in Florida. Her case, like Laura's, had gone cold. Investigators ran fingerprints found on the passport, and the results were nothing short of stunning. The prints matched Daniel Mercer, but under another name entirely. His real identity was Thomas Riley, a man who had been wanted for embezzlement, wire fraud, and identity theft decades earlier. He had vanished before his trial, leaving behind a trail of stolen money and a wife who also disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The news reached Brookfield quickly. People who had once admired Daniel struggled to believe it. The friendly, soft-spoken man who helped with bake sales and coached Little League wasn't just a liar. He was a fugitive. The FBI dug into every detail of his life, piecing together a disturbing timeline. Thomas Riley had changed names at least 3 times, each time creating a new identity in a different state. He was skilled at blending in, creating clean records, and fabricating histories that fooled even the most thorough background checks. Every time someone got close to discovering who he was, that person disappeared or conveniently moved away. Investigators believed Laura might have uncovered the truth about her husband's past. Perhaps she had found old documents, or maybe someone had reached out from his former life. Whatever it was, it had likely cost her life. But despite months of searching, they couldn't find her remains. There was still no body, and without it, prosecutors couldn't charge him with murder. The FBI began tracing Thomas's financial history, uncovering hidden accounts under aliases scattered across different countries. They learned he had transferred money from Laura's life insurance policy into one of those accounts shortly after her disappearance. That transaction, more than anything else, painted the clearest picture of what had happened. Still, Daniel, or Thomas, walked free. He was questioned, but he denied everything. Calm and calculated, he said the passport had nothing to do with him, that the FBI was mistaken. He portrayed himself once again as a man caught in tragedy, misunderstood, and unlucky. Without physical evidence linking him to Laura's death, there was nothing the authorities could do. When the investigation quieted down, he sold his new home and disappeared once again, this time leaving no trace behind. It was as if he had practiced vanishing for a lifetime, and he had. But what Daniel Mercer didn't realize was that this time, his past hadn't just followed him. It was hunting him, and no amount of charm, planning, or deception could keep the truth buried forever. 2 years after Daniel Mercer vanished from Brookfield, a small coincidence reignited the case that had gone cold yet again. A retired man named Harold Jenkins lived across from the Mercers' old house. He had recently asked his grandson to help him update his outdated home security system. When the boy transferred the old footage to a new hard drive, he found a folder labeled from the year Laura disappeared. Harold had completely forgotten that the cameras had been recording back then. Out of curiosity, they began reviewing the old clips, most of which showed harmless scenes: cars passing by, neighborhood kids riding bikes, and Daniel mowing his lawn. Then they found one video that made Harold's blood run cold. The footage was time-stamped at 2:17 a.m. on the night Laura was last seen. The quality was grainy, but clear enough to make out shapes. Daniel appeared on camera dragging a large object across the backyard, wrapped in a thick blanket. The shape was heavy and uneven, long enough to resemble a human body. He stopped near the garage, opened the trunk of his car, and with visible effort, lifted the object inside. A few minutes later, the car's headlights flicked on, and Daniel drove away into the darkness. The discovery was immediately turned over to the police, who then notified the FBI. The footage changed everything. Investigators who had once doubted foul play now had reason to believe that Laura Mercer hadn't left voluntarily. The image was enough to reopen the case and place Daniel, or Thomas Riley, back under investigation. Agents tracked him down in a small town in Texas, where he had been living under yet another name, Michael Trent. He was working as a real estate broker, charming clients with the same easy smile and soft-spoken confidence that had once fooled Brookfield. When agents approached him, he acted surprised but composed. He claimed he had no idea why they were there. When they confronted him with the footage, he calmly explained that the object in the video was an old rug he had thrown away that night. He said the hour was late because he couldn't sleep and wanted to clean out the garage. His story sounded rehearsed, practiced, almost too smooth. Forensic experts examined what remained of Daniel's old car, which had been resold multiple times since he'd left Brookfield. Traces of blood were found in the trunk, faint but still detectable. DNA analysis confirmed it was Laura's. The findings were damning, but Daniel refused to waver. He said Laura had cut herself once while gardening and that he must have transported something of hers unknowingly. His composure unsettled everyone. Even when surrounded by evidence, he acted as if he were still in control. Despite the new developments, prosecutors struggled to build a solid murder case without a body. Daniel's defense team claimed the blood was old and irrelevant, the video inconclusive. The judge agreed there wasn't enough proof for a conviction. Once again, Daniel Mercer walked free, this time under a storm of public scrutiny, but his freedom began to crumble from within. Reporters hounded him, old neighbors came forward with uneasy memories, and people who once admired him now looked at him with suspicion and disgust. His past aliases began surfacing one by one as the FBI traced records linking him to other women who had vanished years apart, each one financially connected to him. The trail pointed toward a pattern stretching across decades, different towns, different names, but the same quiet, charming man whose wives always disappeared. The FBI knew they were close, but they needed something definitive. Something that would finally destroy the illusion Daniel had maintained his entire life. That moment was coming, though Daniel didn't know it yet. Somewhere, deep in the murky past he had tried to bury, the evidence that would end his freedom forever was waiting to be found. The final break in the case came from a place no one expected, an old property record buried deep in a Georgia County archive. An FBI analyst tracing the paper trail of Thomas Riley's previous aliases noticed that one of his past identities, James Danner, had owned a small lakeside cabin nearly 20 years earlier. The property had been abandoned soon after his disappearance and eventually repossessed by the state. The timing matched perfectly with the disappearance of another woman connected to him, a woman he had married under that name. Her case, like Laura's, had never been solved. Investigators decided to search the lake surrounding the cabin. The water was dark and heavy with years of silt, but divers soon discovered something metallic half buried in the mud, an oil drum, sealed tightly with bolts and rust. When they lifted it to the surface and opened it, the smell alone confirmed their fears. Inside were human remains, along with personal items, rings, a watch, and a faded driver's license belonging to the missing woman. The condition of the remains suggested she had been dead for nearly 2 decades. The similarities between her case and Laura's disappearance were too strong to ignore. Both women had vanished after uncovering pieces of their husbands' lies. Both had their finances quietly drained. And both had been married to the same man, just under different names. This discovery gave investigators what they needed. They presented the evidence to a federal grand jury, tying together years of deception, financial fraud, and murder. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Thomas Riley went, women disappeared. When the FBI tracked Daniel to an airport in Arizona, he was carrying a forged passport and a ticket to Belize. He didn't resist arrest. Instead, he smiled faintly, as though he'd been expecting it all along. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the entire web of his crimes. They revealed his multiple identities, his elaborate financial schemes, and the chilling method he used to erase his past each time someone grew suspicious. Witnesses from across the country testified, bankers, neighbors, and even a private investigator who had once followed him years before Laura ever met him. Each testimony chipped away at the mask he had worn for decades. Daniel Mercer, Thomas Riley, James Danner, whatever name he chose, sat in silence as the courtroom heard about the lives he'd built and destroyed. The evidence from the lake tied him directly to the earlier murder, which allowed prosecutors to charge him with multiple counts of homicide and fraud. When forensic analysts matched handwriting from his old aliases to recent documents, his defense collapsed entirely. The jury took less than a day to return their verdict. Guilty on all charges, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Reporters flooded the courtroom, eager to photograph the man who had fooled an entire town, and even the FBI, for so many years. His expression remained calm, almost satisfied, as though being caught was part of a plan he'd always known would end this way. Despite his conviction, one question lingered: the whereabouts of Laura Mercer. Investigators continued searching the woods, the lakes, and the vacant lots around Brookfield, but nothing surfaced. It was as if she had vanished completely, leaving only the faint trace of her blood in his car and the haunting mystery of where she might rest. Years later, the Mercer house was sold to another family. The white fences were repainted, the garden replanted, and life on Maple Drive moved on. But every so often, neighbors still spoke of Daniel Mercer, the man who had smiled so kindly, waved so warmly, and lived so perfectly that no one ever thought to question who he really was. They called him the husband who fooled everyone, even the FBI. And in quiet moments, when the lake mist rolled in thick and gray, people still wondered how many more secrets Thomas Riley had managed to hide beneath the water before his lies finally sank with him.